Okay, well, welcome
Hello.
everyone. We're so excited that you're here. Welcome to Mapping the Mind, the next installment of Conversations on Creative Writing and Healthcare from Bellevue Literary Review. If you don't know BLR, we are a literary journal. Here's one of our recent issues. We publish fiction, poetry, nonfiction about health, illness, and healing. And this year is our 25th anniversary, and we're so excited to celebrate. And we're so excited to then have this wonderful panel of writers to talk about the idea of mapping the mind and what it takes to talk about the deeply lived experiences of mental health. And we're concentrating both on the experiences themselves. We're also looking about the act of writing and how inner life, which can sometimes feel formless or unstable, is given shape through language. So I want to introduce our fabulous panelists. Susanna Cahalan is a journalist and author of Brain on Fire. Damon Tweedy is a psychiatrist and author of Facing the Unseen, The Struggle to Center Mental Health in Medicine, and Sarah Labrie, a TV writer and author of No One Gets to Fall Apart, who, by the way, just won an O. Henry Award for fiction writing, which is really wonderful. So I'm going to give an opening question to all of you, and maybe Susanna will start with you. I'd like to know, when you first began writing about mental health, what was the hardest thing to put into words, and maybe also what surprised you about trying to translate inner experiences into language, especially when the mind may resist a clear or stable story?
Yeah, it's interesting because mental health narrative found me. I didn't find it. My memoir, we're talking specifically about that. I experienced psychosis caused by an autoimmune encephalitis of my brain. So that was visited upon me, and then I started to write about it. And really, what was most challenging for me specifically about writing about this condition and the experience of it was the memory issues. There were the memory issues that were involved in putting this together. So, in many ways, sometimes I have internal and interior experiences, but I would say that Brain on Fire is actually more an active reportage. And I was more documenting my life through the eyes of others, especially at the times I couldn't remember, I couldn't access that internal world. And that made it kind of challenging to have the emotional valiance there to make a reader kind of want to go on this ride with me because for so much of it I wasn't there. So I really had to work on trying to access as much of that through other people, through medical records, through my parents, and then be honest with the reader about how little I actually could access it myself.
So you were really kind of more of a reporter. How
Yes,
interesting.
yes.
But Sarah, you were writing more as a memoir. What was your experience about writing your own interior experiences, getting them onto the page?
Do they sound okay? Because I switched to my headphones. Okay, great. But I want to just say that my answer is so similar to Susanna's, and I think that's why I love her work so much. Susanna was really kind and read my book, and was one of the first blurbers, and her blurb is on the cover, and her book was one of the ones I read when I was trying to figure out how to put the story of my mom developing schizophrenia in her 50s into words. And I also was coming from a very analytical perspective. My background, I'd been trying to write a literary fiction novel about like continental philosophy and France. And so I was really coming from this very intellectual academic angle. And I think I was also afraid of being in touch with the emotional side of what had happened to my mom, my own fear that I might inherit that her mental illness, because what the book is about is sort of tracing its origin point to my great grandmother who had major depressive disorder. We're the descendants of slaves. I go all the way back to the first woman basically who in my family line that we can go back to who wound up in Texas, so 5 generations back. And it was just a lot to carry, and it was very scary, and I was afraid of touching that sort of wire. And so I tried to stay very emotionally distant, and it just ended up being kind of a matter of a collaboration between my agent and my editor, kind of helping me just, like go back to your journal entries, take notes during your therapy sessions. Like, how are you feeling? What is the emotional arc here?
Good. And we will dig much more into that. Damon, now, so you're writing both as a clinician, you're writing a little bit from both sides of the stethoscope. What was challenging about putting these experiences into words, and what surprised you?
Yeah, I guess for me, initially, I came at writing. Initially, my first book was Black Man in a White Coat, and really from the lens of race in medicine. And I think as I was thinking about my work in the mental health field, I felt like there was struck by the parallels. Like there were really sort of these interesting, real clear parallels between the sort of the challenges of African Americans historically in the medical field, but then the parallel with that with sort of even some of the contemporary challenge of those with mental health issues within the field. So it was really that sort of observer distance kind of thing. But during the course of writing the book, just as I did with the first book, is also like, well, how am I affected by this? Like, how did what were the impacts of me? Why did I make this decision to do psychiatry? What were some of my own struggles, and how did the patient struggles um, in some ways relate to my own sort of own struggles? And I felt like that sort of would give the story more resonance and more connection because people could better understand my reactions to certain situations by understanding my own sort of personal sort of connection to them. So that's sort of how it kind of came. It was really, so it kind of fell into place very much initially very detached kind of observer role, but then as the story unfolds, getting more connected to it. I think it's kind of hard. You asked the question, I was like, what does it feel like? I think I don't know. It's always a weird thing. I mean, I guess we're here with writers that can explain it because my natural instinct is pretty, reserved and not introverted. And so it's a kind of an interesting experience to think about writing because right before we got on, Susanna's like, "Oh, I know all about you." It's sort of an interesting thing to think about when you're writing a story. Of course, that's what happens, but it's not something to actually think about in the moment that I'm writing. Writing it. It's a really different experience.
Well, one of the things we talk about a lot in nonfiction is the difference between the author and the narrator. They're often not the same or not exactly the same person, and and in particular, writing about mental experiences, right? They can be
Mhm.
diffuse, they can be recursive, even contradictory. And so I want to talk about kind of how we give that form on the page. And Sarah, you're a TV writer, which is all about form and structure. And I'm wondering, how you gave some of these experiences form on the page, and were there any aspects of the mind, perception, memory, thought that actually resisted narration onto the page?
Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah, I think it was very important to me to write well, to make sure that the book was not just a story that was about me, it was about me processing what had happened to me and my family. Um, the abuse I had dealt with as a child, and then my mother's later in life diagnosis. It needed an arc. And I my process was just sort of writing down everything I remembered, putting it in Scrivener, which is a sort of word processing app that allows you to move different pieces around, like they're basically digital note cards. And from there, just shaping it and honing it, giving it to people. I got a lot of feedback, and then my agent and I broke down what I had written. Actually, no, this was my editor. After I sold the book, my editor was like, I love this. We can't publish it. I need you to write me a letter about how you're going to make it better. And that's what I'm going to give to my boss. And then everything's going to be okay. Don't worry. So I basically had to go back to a finished book, write a one-page proposal. These are the arcs. These are the emotional arcs. We're going to look at ambition. We're going to look at nostalgia. We're going to look at memories of trauma, and how they change. And then we're going to have all of this sort of academic research that you did around schizophrenia and what the diagnosis looks like and how messy it is. And we're going to separate those four sort of trains of thought and then interweave them together. So again, that was a very collaborative, very sort of carefully worked out process. I looked to Melissa Febos a lot. She's a great memoirist who also has written a lot about structure and how to actually write a memoir. I literally read Writing Memoir for Dummies. I went to the fundamentals because that felt so important. I needed to know, yes, the story was for me, but I wanted it to be worth the reader's time.
It's really interesting how you say that because I think most authors, and I'll include myself, kind of spill it onto the page and only later figure out what were the emotional arcs, the narrative arcs, and the way you approach it's almost clinical. I mean, I think it strikes me and maybe Damon too about, it's very much like the way we are in medicine. Okay, here's the assessment and plan and all these things. So I think that's really quite interesting. Suzanne, I'm going to turn to you and ask you if, in writing about issues that involve the mind, especially when the mind is going awry. Uh, Um, how how did you get it to get form on the page? And when were there
Mhm.
parts that even with eyewitness accounts, you still couldn't narrate?
I have to say, like, I relate so much to what Sarah and Damon are saying because I actually think there was the first layer of this narrative. Well, maybe the second layer was extremely clinically distant in a way. I'm not a clinician, but I felt it was like a lawyer building a case for what happened. But you had to have that emotional register. And what really helped me was before I started any research, before I filled my mind with other people's memories, I put pen to paper. I mean, used a pen and wrote in a notebook everything that I could remember. And that in many ways became my kind of lodestar because I developed so many false memories during the course of writing the book and researching it that I could always return to this kind of document that was this, this basically like, okay, this is a template for what I remember happening. So that was the first thing. And that's probably maybe the most raw and emotional document that I have. And then from there, started to build out what I could put together through kind of various layers of kind of objective and subjective facts. So I had my medical record and I combed through my medical record, and that could give me, dates of tests. It gave me clinicians' perspectives. It gave me names of people to interview. And then from there to kind of build out the emotional world, I started to interview my parents, my friends who came and visited. And, the parts that were really hard to get at were with psychosis, really is hard to convey that feeling, the overwhelming, all encompassing feeling of psychosis, which is extremely real, but yet extremely surreal at the same time. So having both those elements was very difficult. And to kind of talk about that and also the emotional kind of relevance of this is that I wanted to be very honest with the reader about what I could remember, what I couldn't remember. So the second part of my book, which is when I'm the most psychotic but also have the most issues with my memory, I initially wrote in third person because I wanted to be like, okay, Susanna did this, Susanna did that. And that's how I handed it in to my first readers. And the resounding response was, it's too distant. We don't feel what you're feeling. And really, all I did was change Susanna to I. I did a little bit more than that, but not much. And it had a totally different effect on the reader. So that was
That's
something that
great.
I did to try to reach that. Yeah.
It's funny. We just had our writing workshops a couple of months ago, and one of the things we talk about is perspective and point of view, and that craft has such a powerful effect on even just changing Susanna to I
Yeah.
completely reorients how the power of the story comes across. And you wouldn't think such a tiny thing would do it, but it can, which is why we talk so much about craft and structure. Thank you. Damon, in your book, Facing the Unseen, you move between your role as a psychiatrist and your own proximity to mental health struggles. And I'm wondering, how did you negotiate those two perspectives on the page? I mean, I'm sure in real life there was its own part, but I'm curious on the page, how did you do that? Or you just have to unmute.
Gosh, how many years have we been doing this now? I think a lot of what Sarah and Suzanne has said, uh, really resonate with me. One is the idea of initially starting with a series of kind of like stories, ideas, putting it out onto the page, and then sort of going back and sort of like trying to make it more coherent and structured and those sorts of things. I think that was a big part for me. Also, it's a lot of, also a lot of research. So just like Sarah mentioned, she'd read just about every book that's, from memoirs. I think I've read just, it feels like anything that's about any kind of medical memoir or any book written by sort of mental health, or psychiatrists or, so medical in general, but also specifically psychiatrists and psychologists. And so I've read so many and seen how they have structured things. I think that also helped me think about what it would look like for me. So my book is mostly, so it's mostly from the clinician standpoint. There's one chapter where, part of a chapter where I talk about, some struggles that I had during my internship year. And I use that as a sense of like an entry point to like, I came at this field in a more detached way, and how that was kind of humbled in that sort of way. And then I think hopefully my goal is that then as the reader reads subsequent chapters, they can sort of feel that sort of that humility sort of baking into how I view patients, the subsequent patient interaction. So that was sort of the structure in which I tried to frame it as someone
Well,
who kind of came at it detached, a more detached lens, but then you have a setback or a crisis, and then you're able to sort of see it in a different lens and how that then animates your subsequent interactions throughout the story.
I mean, as your title suggests, the book attends closely to what medicine often overlooks.
Sure.
And so I'm curious how you approach writing about things that are unseen. Did you have to change something in your own perspective? Did you write differently about the typically unseen things versus the things that are easily seen?
Well, I mean, well, certainly as a clinician going through the training, I was very much biased, as I talk about in the book, very much biased towards what you can see, what you can sort of put your fingers on. I was very sort of, um, you know, skeptical, right? And so I think a lot of the book is sort of that journey. How did you go from this person who's sort of trained in the traditional sort of medical model, and begin to think differently. So, I don't know. I don't know. So I think at this point, I've been doing it so long. I think that I realized that the lines aren't nearly as clear as I initially thought. I thought the lines are very clear. Like there's quote unquote real illness, physical illness, and there's this sort of like other thing. And I realized that the lines are much blurrier. And I think that that's informed how I approach writing about both things, honestly. As was writing this book, I became more cognizant of how much of the kind of what we might consider traditional physical medicine itself is blurry, in ways that I didn't really think about until I started writing this book about mental illness. I think, wow, I took so many of the medical illness that I learned about in school and in internship and whatnot. I took them as for face value without really thinking about how blurry they can be and the boundary. And so I think that that was also eye-opening in the other direction for me when I think about writing the book.
I mean, I will second that. I mean, for me in medical school, I walked away with the diagnostic criteria of, for rheumatoid arthritis, here's the
Yeah,
6 things to check off.
exactly.
And nobody comes in like that at
Yes.
all.
Yes,
And
exactly.
so it's quite a bit blurrier. And also there is such an overlap of mental and psychological, issues and illnesses with physical illness that intertwine. And particularly in primary care where I rest, you can't tweeze them out. We like to like separate out the problem list,
Hmm.
depression, anxiety, hypertension,
Hmm.
diabetes, but nobody lives like that, right? They
Hmm.
live with all those things at once. And so I think, when we write, we have to think about those things you know, are all happening at once. So, Sarah, I wanted to ask you, and by the way, you can all feel free to jump in anytime. The title of your book, No One Gets to Fall Apart, suggests a kind of like prohibition, like thou shalt not unravel. Um, and I'm curious about that. And I'm wondering also if that in your writing, of course, the titles may come later, but I'm wondering if in your writing you felt this sort of drive to explore that constraint or push against that restraint.
Yeah, I think the original title of this book was The Anatomy Book, which is the title of the novel in the book that I'm trying and failing to write. And that is slowly driving me insane as my mom is being diagnosed with like literal clinical psychosis. And eventually, I think the publishing process went on for so long that by the time the manuscript was done, my editor kind of said, I don't think that title fits anymore. And so we were just kind of looking through it for other lines, things to pull out. And the title comes from this moment right after I found out that my mom is delusional and has been institutionalized basically against her will. And no one had told me in my family. They were back in Houston. I'm in California. And I'm at a wedding, and a friend is telling me about his father who's been diagnosed with cancer. And he's really just keeping it together at this party. And I am literally falling apart, and all our closest friends are getting married. And something that my husband had said to me was just, yeah, no one gets to fall apart. Like you can't fall apart. You have to keep going. And I did kind of bristle against that. And I think what it has come to mean for me and what reveals itself to me in the book is like people fall apart. Oh, am I muted? I see something in the chat saying,
No,
okay,
we
you're
hear you
fine.
fine.
Okay. But then you kind of have to just get up. Like you fall apart, you're on the floor, everything is over, it's the end, you're at the bottom of the pit, but you have to just get back up. You want to fall through the floor and then there's just more floor underneath. Like you just keep going the next day. So that is kind of, and you kind of have to take that as you will. You kind of get to decide what that means for you. So
Did
it's
you
like,
did you feel that in your writing at all? Like were you falling apart in your writing of this book?
Hmm.
Absolutely. I was falling apart while I was writing the book because I was also still sort of trying to write the novel that was failing. And that was just proving so impossible. And I was failing and I had given everything to this project. I did not have a backup plan. I didn't have a plan B. I had no money and like no professional skills beyond writing. I had a terrible office job that I felt like was slowly killing me. And I just thought, oh no, like this cannot. And then on top of all of that, my mom was sick. My best friend had sort of broken up with me out of the blue. And writing was the only thing that was holding me together. And, that's no small thing. I mean, I think at the time I kind of took it for granted. Well, I'm going to wake up and write every morning. But now I think that's the thing that saved me. Like that is how I got through because I had that one anchor, that discipline, that practice that had gotten me as far as it had. And that continued to sort of carry me forward. And that writing, the writing practice and the community that had come up around it. So my husband's also a writer, my writing group, my friends, that desire to write well was kind of the thing that saved me. So,
And I think that the idea of form and structure in writing, it often comes up in poetry. We have different forms, villanelles and uh, gazelles, all kinds of forms that seem odd initially. But if you look at the sonnet structure, why do I have to write this way or a limerick? But sometimes those constraints are supporting us and allow us, we can work. Okay, here's the game plan, guys. I'm gonna write 500 words a day or three rhyming couplets, and then I'm gonna work in there, and that constraint can also be a support. So yeah, thank you so much for that. Susanna, Brain on Fire is such an interesting book because it reconstructs things you can't remember, right? And you're relying on other people's observations who may also misremember or be biased or have their own, invented memories or assumptions. Um, so I guess one question is, what does it mean to tell a story where
Mhm.
you only have piecemeal access and you're relying on others, but also, um, did that ever shift your sense of authorship or narrative authority when other people are supplying key parts of your narrative?
You know, I come from journalism reporting, so that's always part of to me. I love that, Sarah. I love that you're working with fiction, and that I'm so impressed by that people can create worlds within. Like wow, like that's amazing to me. For me, I'm always kind of like collaging. I feel I always am putting together either articles or books or pieces of work with like from various sources. So that's how I work. That's kind of where my strength is. I wish that I could sit in a cabin in the woods and something from within just like glows. Like I'm sure. I am surprised that this novel didn't work out because I'm sure there are other novels in the queue and something you just want to major award for your fiction. So, but I do really admire that in people that I know who can do both, which I think is very unusual. I have a few people I know who can do both well, and it's pretty astounding. So I will say that. So I'm used to that. I'm used to kind of I don't I'm very comfortable with actually it's interesting. I have a little writing kind of thing behind me that has various things on it. And for my most recent book, I had to put a note card that says you are the authority. Because so often I do like to use collage and to use other people's perspectives and allow the reader to come through with their take on it. But unfortunately, that's just oftentimes doesn't work. Like there needs to be, we need to depend on someone that you can have unreliable narrators, which I was in Brain on Fire, but I think we need someone who has a strong perspective that we're following through a narrative to make sense of it. And sometimes I defer to my sources too much. Brain on Fire allowed that for me because, again, it was kind of part of the kind of book itself was the idea of this kind of bifurcated reality. Even just in the basis of the kind of physician's perspective was so different than my perspective on the psychosis, which was also different than my father's perspective on what was going on. That to me was it's kind of baked into the book, so it worked. But when I recently did a biography, I am the author. I have the intention here of telling this story, and I have to kind of lean into that. And that's something that I really have to work on. As Sarah had said about her, the first draft of being like, okay, you have to find kind of find your voice in a way, find the purpose of this. I really like my first drafts tend to be not only bloated, but a little bit they lack confidence, and it's with subsequent drafts that I get that I am the expert, kind of bravado over time.
You know, when you say unreliable narrator, this brings to mind, maybe Damon, you feel this too, the term poor historian that we use in medicine, not so much now, but we
Hmm.
typically it's when the patient doesn't know their history, we call them a poor historian, which always cracks me up. I always say on my team, like, what are they,
I've
a
never
poor
heard that
architect?
before.
Oh, yes, it's
Oh, it's a staple
I
in medical
love that.
education.
I
Yeah,
can't believe it.
you'll see medical charts where it'll say patient is a poor historian. So we
Oh,
can't we can't
poor
historian.
historian.
So we can't really rely on what they're saying. So we have to piece together
It also takes
things.
the blame off us when you're
Yes,
presenting the case to your attending and you don't have all the
exactly,
data. Well, the patient was a poor historian, so I couldn't. That. But on the other hand,
exactly.
the patient is also the expert. And so,
Right.
David, I'm wondering when your patients are narrating their story, and of course, in psychiatry, there's much more narrative that patients are bringing to you. You know, when they are sort of a quote, poor historian or an unreliable narrator, how do you, as a clinician, but also as a writer, because underneath that, you're still thinking of story, how do you put that together?
Yeah, and so sometimes, I mean, sometimes you probably never get it all put together, because in some ways we talk about this. We not joke about it, but we sort of have these discussions amongst our colleagues that, we probably only know, 10%, 20% of our, patients' lives. Sometimes, sometimes you feel that way because you're not really sure about piecing together. In psychiatry, I mean, one thing we often do, just going back to Susanna's point, there's this whole term about collateral. There's a term called collateral we always use in psychiatry, where we're always piecing together information from family members or from friends or from partners, and that so we lean on that more in psychiatry than other areas of medicine, specifically because of this whole idea of the quote unreliable narrator. We do that quite a bit, but sometimes it takes a while to really piece things together. Um, I think it's just kind of sort of putting all the our what do you call it, cleaning the closet out in terms of psychiatry. I mean, in medicine in general. I mean, there's this other thing that sometimes happens in psychiatry where a patient, because the bounds of what's real and what's not, right? So sometimes a patient may say something that seems far-fetched, right? And it can be easy to say, well, that's a delusion. But I can tell you that pretty much every psychiatrist out there has learned that a lot of things that we initially thought were a delusion, it ends up being true. You're like, wow. I never even so it makes me so I guess what it means for me in practice is I try and really come at it very open-ended. You got to have a certain degree of patience and be willing to sort of, work through and figure out kind of what that story is. But it's not always present. The problem with the medical model is that you're given 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and it's not always going to come out in that 15, 20 minute, 30-minute visit. And so that's one of the limitations. But no, I mean I think it's something that I've learn to adapt to. But yeah, but Daniel, you're very right. The poor historian is we don't use that terminology anymore, but it's certainly something that it was very much part of our training for sure.
Okay, it was
Yeah.
really it's
Yes.
really
Wow.
terrible when I think about it
I
now.
have to tell you that
Yeah.
I was a poor historian for sure when I was sick,
Sure.
and but also some of the doctors were poor historians as well. So it was on both sides of this. Whereas at various points I was saying I have multiple personality disorder. My grandmother had bipolar disorder, which was true, but also not true. Not diagnosed.
Hmm.
But then I did say, oh, someone had asked me how much are you drinking a day, and I had said about a glass or two of wine a night, and the doctor had written down a bottle or two of
Yeah.
wine, which totally shifted the way that I was seen and like, kind of like the silo that I was placed in for that
Well,
period of
Suzanne, I have
time.
to tell you, one other thing we're taught in medical school is to
Yes.
double whatever the patient
Yes.
says for alcohol,
I've
I,
heard
at
this.
least
yeah. I was
double.
just going to say that. Yeah. Yeah. We're taught to double. Like a patient
Uh,
says they drink 3 beers, you put six, which again is pretty. Yeah.
Terrible.
Sarah's looking at Sarah's just shaking her. She's like, "What is this? What in the world is? What
Well,
kind of culture?"
I have a friend whose parents are doctors who told me if the doctor ever asks you if how much you drink, you say, I don't drink. And I guess that's why she told me to say that because she knew that her parents must have told her that. Like you say, you
Yeah.
don't drink, you say you don't have any substances, you don't, and I don't drink anymore, but I used to, but I definitely lied about it back then.
And
But
Sarah, I'm
but
actually curious how much the unreliable narrator came up in your story of your mother. Who was the unreliable narrator, if any?
Yeah, I think when you're writing about yourself, you have to make yourself a character. And we talked about that a little bit. And I think I'm lucky that I was able to detach my own view of myself from the person on the page who I knew would make a good story, because I've written so much fiction, and a lot of my short story, the main characters of my stories were thinly veiled versions of me. So I knew what a fictional version of myself looked like, and it was pretty easy to transpose that into a nonfiction version of my life. So I was kind of playing with the tool of the unreliable narrator. I wanted people to wonder how much of what I was saying was correct and how much, especially there's a thread in here of my absolute best friend in the world in college, who's, one of the only other Black writers at Brown when we were there together. Really helped me, taught me how to be relentless, how to get into grad school, and then ultimately kind of betrayed my trust in this sort of way that felt to me like deeply immoral. And I wanted the reader to wonder whose side to be on. I wanted them to think, oh, maybe Sarah's not the victim here. She thinks she is, but maybe she's not. That was important to me, because I felt like if I didn't want it to ever feel like there was any score settling or vindictiveness. I needed, even though I very much felt like I had a score to settle. And that came out in the first draft. And I realized, oh, this is not going to work. Like, I need the reader to be able to see all sides of this story and maybe to distrust me a little bit. And I think that's where like having an MFA in fiction was really helpful, having read a lot of fiction, because I knew that unreliable narrator could be a very powerful tool when deployed on purpose.
Yeah, so I think I'll just point out again, like leaning back to craft, which is what we're always sort of thinking about as writers and writers to be, that we can use these strategies, that the unreliable narrator can be a specific thing you choose to do to put in to add an element of mystery, a little bit of confusion, obviously not never too much confusion. You don't want to have your writers just close the book, but finding a way to present uncertainty, with the narrator's eye. Damon, yeah, jump in.
Yeah, I just want to just to kind of piggyback. I saw a couple comments. I just want to clarify. So, you're taught that in medical school. I don't actually do that today. Like, I don't just double, and I don't. But that's something that you learn from people. But I think there's a bigger interesting point is the idea, like, just the art of being a doctor. I mean, just the practice of being a doctor. There's this whole idea of narration, right? You mentioned being an unreliable narrator. This idea that a patient's telling us they come to you, and you're the one that's then telling their story, like you through a process that then becomes part of a record that then lives on, and so then the next doctor sees your narrative, right, and then they can either make preformed opinions based on that may be right or wrong. I think the whole process is very, so when I talk to medical students, I really focus on that, like this idea that there's a certain power in that doctor and patient enter into a room and you're the only one coming out telling what the story, what happened in that room in a way. And I think there's something about that that's really important to think about and to honor and to think and to really be as clear and careful as you can, because if you aren't, you can do this thing where you yourself become the unreliable narrator of this person's story that then lives on in the medical system, and that person doesn't have a voice in that. So I think it's this really interesting phenomenon that I've really been attuned to more. So I think the poor historian part can go both ways, just as we were saying. And as a doctor, it lives on in a way that's really can be dangerous if it's not done the right way.
Right.
I love that so much. And I think there's so much in conversation here. Like, I think also, so many of us are imposing a narrative on our lives. And that narrative is something, again, that is imposed. There's so much chaos in our life narratives. We decide what the past looks like from the present moment. And I think that you can see some of that with, the lies that we tell ourselves that sometimes come through in medical settings as well. So it's not an easy job, I'm sure, for a physician, especially a psychiatrist, to parse that out. It's kind of an impossible job in a way, which I think should be, even for all the moments in my own narrative and, other kind of stories that I've investigated over the years of sometimes malpractice, sometimes things that were outright wrong. They're also, you have to acknowledge the bind that many doctors are in, because they are, especially psychiatrists, really working with what the patient reports to them.
Yeah, Danielle, do you ever feel that way that you're telling this other, you come into a room and you're the one coming out with the story? It feels like it's, I mean, do you ever have that sort of
Oh,
feeling?
all the time. And I'm thinking in
Yeah.
particular, I was in clinic this morning and I've had a couple of patients who have sort of chronic diffuse pain that doesn't fit into any easy box. And those are the really challenging patients
Mhm.
in physical medicine where there's a lot going on and not an easy paradigm. So we have to impose some kind of narrative structure on that. I got to put something on the page, but I feel a little guilty because I'm putting my narrative on the page and I'm trying to help the patient, trying to tease out theirs, but often it's, all over the place. There's history, there's social issues, economic issues, psychiatric issues, economic issues, and so many things that about bad shoes issues that come in and contribute to pain. And it is hard to get all that on the page. And of course, you don't want to just be sitting typing while your patient's talking. There's actually a question, and Damon, I'll leave it to you. Someone asked, do you think about the craft of storytelling when you're actually practicing medicine? Do you think about structure of character and plot when you're talking with a patient?
I mean, to some, yeah. So, because someone says in the note that a chart. I think I didn't read it carefully. I'm hard with toggling. Like it's a legal document, and there's certainly that's certainly true in its purest sense. But yeah, I think, but I know that, but so much of like medicine is like, you get a consult, and then so your first encounter with that person is through the story of another doctor's interpretation of that patient. I think that's particularly how I see it a lot, how patients come to me. And so I think it is important to think about how you um, craft, what that person is presenting to you, because that does become something that then that can impact how they then kind of go through the next step. So yeah, so do I see like a narrative to things? I think there's, I mean, it's not intentional, but I mean, not in the sense where I'm trying to tell a story in some sort of like, I don't know, I'm not sure the right way to describe it, but yeah, I think the short answer is yes. It's important to do that because I do think that um, I know I've seen it myself. I've been part of it. How that first encounter with that patient's chart can determine how you then go into the room and approach that patient. I've seen it time and again, so I do know that. I do think I try and honor that as I writing the note, thinking about what is that next person going to see when they see this note and how this person is described. I think it's important
Yeah, and
personally.
it's very true because when we often read the chart, we'll read the last person's note and you'll see, oh,
Yes,
this patient was, and there's sometimes may frame things in a way that,
yes,
is is less than honest in some ways. And here's a
yes.
question from Amy, what do physician writers get wrong that non-physician narrators get right and vice versa? And Susanna, you had a chance to read a lot of physician writers in your chart.
Yes.
What did they get wrong?
Oh, that's
That's a
such
good
a great
question.
question. A really great question. I mean, a whole lot. I mean, beyond just that I was misdiagnosed for a month, beyond the very kind of concrete things that were wrong. But I'll give you an example of something that was subtle, and someone who's a wonderful doctor. So, and I think to Sarah's point before about score settling, that's for the first draft. You can write all the animus out, all the anger out in the first draft, and you really need to. I'm not into those kind of narratives, and I don't think anyone here it really is into that. But in terms of something that a doctor got wrong, who's a very good doctor, a psychiatrist, was when she had first come into the room, I was actively psychotic, and I think the rule out diagnosis at that point was bipolar 1. And I was wearing a white t-shirt that was like maybe a little see-through, like just like a little bit like a linen-y blend, and black leggings. And she wrote down with the bipolar 1 diagnosis that had come from a previous doctor, to Damon's point, that I was wearing a revealing outfit. And now, it's interesting, which, I think it wouldn't be in the notes now because the notes are more transparent. A lot of patients see their notes. Back then, I had to like really actively get them. A lot of them were handwritten. Some of them were. It was at the point where it was kind of going from written to computer. But yes, what she was seeing was a kind of a hypersexuality, perhaps that coincided with her bipolar 1 diagnosis. So kind of everything I was doing was further confirmation of the diagnosis she had in her mind from a previous note.
And I think the
Absolutely.
transparency of charts is so interesting now. Like, a lot of times when we write about someone's mental state, particularly patients who are depressed, we'll comment if they're well groomed or poorly groomed. That's often an indication. But of course, now that patients read it, well groomed, or who are you commenting on, on my on my grooming skills, but it is and it is true when someone shows up and they look disheveled, you know that their mental state has worsened. But now that patients read the chart, we kind of leave all of that out. So in some ways, we've lost some descriptive ability in the chart. Damon, what do you think?
Yeah, I remember that transition. I think I've adapted to it in a way. Um, I don't think it really influences. Honestly, at this point, I've been doing it so long. I don't think. Well, I think I've just acclimated to the way where I don't think. Oh, gee, this patient might read this. Should I put this in there? I don't think I've. So I guess I've adapted. I think that when that first sort of changed, I think I probably was cognizant of it. But I don't know. I mean, some of the things that were in charts before probably shouldn't have. They probably shouldn't have been in there, right? And some of the ways in which they were written. So yeah, I don't think it really enters into my thinking right now. Oh, this person might see this. Yeah, I don't think so. That's interesting. It's an interesting point though, is because I think I heard doctors say that, but for me personally, no.
Yeah, it's interesting. And one of the things as we're writing about, let's say in our literary writing, like you, Sarah, writing about your mother's mental state, I mean, how does one write about such a delicate and tender and vulnerable subject without kind of reducing it to like just this sentimental characterization? How do you do that?
That was so important to me. I think there were uh, a lot of sort of different paths I took to get there because at the time I was writing, I also was acutely aware that like I'm a Black woman, my mom's a Black woman. There were like various narratives around Blackness and women and mental health that were kind of solidifying in social media discourse and sometimes for good, sometimes for the worse. And it just felt like often her story, my story were being told for us in a way that benefited social media platforms and sort of content producers, but did not feel at all accurate to my experience or her experience. And that like she was treated, we were both, suffered at the hands of the medical establishment, but we weren't always, it was nuanced. She got help in a place like Texas, which I think a lot of people would write off completely for their mental health support. But in fact, they had a really great program for people like her who were, was for sort of violently mentally ill people. The county managed to set up a program where a social worker came out, would give her her meds. She had access to like pretty top-notch psychiatric help and therapy. Now it didn't last, it didn't work because she disenrolled herself from the program, which was her right as an adult, and that was a complicated thing. But I wanted to make sure that she never was portrayed just as a victim. And she also, when I was young, she was quite abusive, and I wanted that to be in there too. She wasn't a perfect person. But she was a wonderful person in a lot of ways. She's the reason I was able to write the book. And so I felt like sometimes there are these very cookie cutter narratives that will appeal to maybe a larger number of readers or, a more commercial audience. And I just really went as hard against that as I could. It was very important to me to be as specific as possible to say, no, my mother is an individual. I am an individual. These are just two stories of many, many stories about Black women that are all incredibly different.
And so I'm curious, how did your family, who then read this book, your take on your mother, how was their sense of the narration and the story?
So I was lucky, it was important to me to be honest, because I felt like I have a writing mentor in screenwriting who says that as you get older, as an adult, it almost feels illegal to express emotion, to tell the truth about how you're feeling. It almost becomes a marker of adulthood that you are not allowed to freely express yourself. But writers are the only people who actually are required to do that, right? There's no point in doing it if you're not going to be as honest as possible. Why bother? And so I wrote some things that I knew my family might not like or that might make them sad, but I made sure I could back up everything with evidence, either, a recorded interview that they knew was being recorded or journal entries or notes. And so I was kind of ready for a fight. I was ready for people to get mad at me. And then no one did. Everyone was so happy. I think my aunt, who figures prominently into the book as a caretaker for my mother, was just proud of me and happy that I was able to do what I had always wanted to do, which was publish a book. My grandmother chose not to read it because she knew that it would make her sad. And I respect that. And she's so sweet. She shares every story that comes out about the book on Facebook. And she she didn't come to my book launch in Houston, but all of her friends did. So there were like, 20, 80-year-old Black women like in the bookstore seats, like in the front row, like cheering me on and buying 5 books each. She sent her whole posse. She, like me, tends to kind of prioritize the intellect and not emotions. And I think for her, it was scary to sort of,
Well,
maybe, yeah.
so Jennifer asked in the chat about obtaining permission, and I'm wondering, did you obtain permission from everyone in the book that you wrote about?
No, but when it was done, I sent everyone who is in the book the manuscript and said, you can read this, you can correct anything you don't think is respectful, and I want your feedback. And I just gave everyone the option.
Good. Yeah, and Damon, how about you? How do you handle permissions from your patients who are
Yeah, I think it's
often,
very similar to, again, having read so many books and written by psychiatrists and neurologists and other doctors who sort of preceded me. A lot of the same sort of, model. I mean, even yourself, and so in many cases, it's some cases permission, but in many cases, details have been kind of, a little bit modified. So it's not like this a patient coming back saying, "Oh, why did you, you know, right so those are sort of things that I've done. Some cases things have been a long time ago, people are deceased. I mean, they're all they're different
yeah.
stories in different settings. Yeah, how have you kind of, I know you've asked me that question previously. Yeah, what is your approach to
Yeah.
that?
So well, in the book I'm writing now, for each person, I've specifically asked them when I interview
Hmm.
them,
Yep.
is it okay? And I send them to them. Here's what I've written.
And I do
Please
that
let me
too.
know if I've,
Yes.
corrected this.
Yeah.
And even now I do that for researchers. I had the experience of, yeah, I thought
Yep.
for researchers, I wouldn't have to, if I've interviewed them about their study. I had one researcher quite upset when the book was published that I said I got her research entirely wrong. So burned once, I even show the academics. I've
I
portrayed your studies that are accurate.
yeah, I do the same thing as well. Yes, I do that as well.
Yeah. I wanted one of the things, Sarah, you mentioned, um, sort of hinted at a social justice element of writing, and some of our audience submitted questions in advance, and Maureen asked about writing about social justice, and how much does it play a role in your writing? Maybe Sarah, you'll take that first, but Suzanne, I'm also curious about you if that comes up in your writing at all.
Well, Brain on Fire was done explicitly to spread the word about the condition. So in that way, yes. I mean, that's why I wrote the book. It started as an article. The article led to many diagnoses, even just that. And so I knew, and at the time when I was diagnosed, I was the 217th person in the world with the condition. So it was imperative to get the word out about it. And then the emails that I got subsequently from that first article showed me it really needs to be out there. And so it became my mission. I wrote the book, and then really the book was kind of the means to then start doing grand rounds, which I did grand rounds around the world, but mostly in this country. And so in terms of that aspect, that was a key part of writing the book for sure.
And for those who don't know, in medicine, Grand Rounds is the weekly or monthly meeting of a whole department of the faculty and students. Each department has one, and that's kind of the education of the department. So those are very important ways. And Sarah, how did you think about social justice as you were writing this book?
So I think the elements of social justice that played most prominently into the writing were, I think often Black people will not seek therapy, especially in Texas, where I'm from, especially in my generation. And I wanted to sort of talk openly about things like depression. I write about my eating disorder that I had in college. I hadn't really seen a lot of writing around those things and sort of the complications that are involved. It's not, nothing is 100% black and white. And so I wanted to talk about that. I wanted people to know what psychosis looked like. Like Susanna's book helped me understand what was going on with my mom so much and just like how to find more information about it. There's another book called Heartberries by Therese Marie Milo, where she's writing about her own mental illness and her relationship to her children. And there's a book by Leslie Jameson called The Recovering, I think, about her alcoholism, which just the way that she wrote about it, all of those books just helped me so much. And I wanted to also kind of open the door for conversations that people maybe weren't having about Black women and mental illness. And at the same time, like I said, I felt like there was this idea of like Black women that was being commodified, and there were sort of people who it felt like there was like a story that was solidifying, that was making a lot of, again, a lot of social media platforms, a lot of money, that I just felt like a lot of resistance towards. I was writing this book. I think it sold
Did the
in
social
the early
justice
20s.
ever did the social justice ever feel pressuring? Like, oh, I in just into writing my story, I've got to do this thing because it's the right thing to do. Did that ever feel pressuring to you?
And that, like that specific sort of version of like what it, Black female representation, I'm the type of person where if I feel like someone really is like making me do something, I'll do the exact opposite. So I was like, it was important to me to like push back against that, but I was also like, oh my God, people are going to be so mad. Like people are going to be mad at me that I'm writing this way, about race and racial conflict and my own experience of sort of social justice TM that was like going crazy on Twitter at the time. And then that ended up not being true. Like it was, people understood the nuance. We had conversations. There were people who disagreed with the way that I presented my story, but no one was mean about it. People just were open to conversation. And I think that gave me a lot of faith in readers. Yeah.
Well, that is great to hear. Damon, your book feels like it really sort of comes from social justice as the initial point. Is that true?
Well, see, I can relate to Sarah a lot, particularly if you think about the first book, which is about my book was about my journey about race in medicine, and there's a certain way in which people might want that to be written, and I'm someone who like really sort of navigates in the sort of gray area and the messiness of life, right? And so things aren't as always as clear. I mean, the narrative isn't always as clear as someone people might want it to be, in a purest form. And so I think that probably, I probably would have sold many more. I mean, the book I've done well, but I could have probably sold a lot more books and had a lot more, if I would have taken it in that certain way. Like you said, do you feel pressure to do a certain type of story? But I feel like you have to be your authentic self when you're telling those stories. And so that was more important to me than sort of trying to just maximize, followers or money or those sorts of things. Um, and and so the book about psychiatry sort of was an outgrowth of that, because I think that I think it's we talk about discrimination, and I think it's more clear, historically in this country, the issues of the race is, the issues are pretty much clearer, the issues of segregation and slavery, et cetera. But I think there's real parallels to draw with how, some of the challenges that we see in the mental health field that are not as clear. But they parallel quite a bit. So when you think about, I thought about this book, even the idea of facing the unseen, um, it kind of derived from a James Baldwin quote from an essay he'd written back in the '60s about race, about the civil rights movement and about race in America. And I thought how much it really applied to the space of mental health, because I think about in those days, Black people couldn't, care was segregated. You go to a hospital, you can't get treatment because you're Black. But there are these parallels now, even in our modern time, with mental health issues. A person comes to the emergency department, they have a physical health illness, they can be admitted. Person has a mental health issue, they stay in the ED for days, weeks, can't be. And so there's a lot of parallels. And so for me, there was a mission to sort of bring that to light. This idea that things that were hiding in plain sight were really affecting people. And so the way in which I think about writing about it is, there's the data, and the data way of looking at it, like these are the facts, this is the data. But then I also thought that there's something to telling a story. Like this is what it actually looks like. It's one thing to know that this is, in theory, this is what happens, but this is what it looks like for a person. This is that person's story, and this is how it then and how that really displays the inadequacy or the discrimination and bias that's as it present. So to me, that's how I sort of think about it. I think about using story as a way to sort of convey um, you know complex issues in a way that will hopefully help begin to shift minds and hearts. So that's sort
Here,
of how I
here.
see it.
Here, here. There's a really interesting question that Cynthia sent in advance, wondering what responsibility do you, as a writer sharing stories about mental illness, have to your readers to encourage them to seek appropriate treatment, even if you haven't done it. For example, you didn't seek therapy when you should have. Should you be saying, "Hey guys, make sure you seek therapy"? Do you have this responsibility as a writer in there? I don't know, Susanna, can I
Yeah.
bust in?
It's a great question.
I think that I actually grappled with that. There was a lot in my second book because my second book's about psychiatry, but I focus on Brain on Fire. With it, I actually didn't do the requisite therapy or occupational therapy. I really didn't want to. It actually made me very aware. I was supposed to do speech therapy. I was supposed to do it all across the board. And I hated it. I hated doing it because it made me very aware of my limitations and it made me aware of how far I had to go in my recovery. And so I actually avoided doing them. And I was honest. This is a book of my, it's the facts, and I had to tell the reader what happened. But I did write in there that like, don't. I think I said something to the effect of like, if I could do it again, I wouldn't do that. And when I talk about it, I'm very, careful to underscore that. But at the end of the day, I feel that my responsibility is to telling the truth, even if that truth is not the way that the kind of best practices should be in medicine. There are plenty of points in my story where that's not the case, but I'm at the end of the day, I see myself more in the kind of journalistic side of things, and that's my responsibility. My responsibility kind of was twofold. It was to telling the truth, but also spreading the word about this condition while telling an interesting story. So some of those things are in conflict with each other, and at the end of the day, I think the kind of highest goal for me is to tell the truth.
Thank you. And well, Damon, as a physician, do you feel like you have to, even if you may have fallen short in your own approaches, to sort of advise your readers, hey, don't quite do what I did, but here's what you should do?
I think there's a lot of that, particularly from the more medical side. Like I'm speaking to the younger generations of doctors, right? People who are in training now or in practice, or future doctors, medical students. There's this idea of like these are lessons you can hopefully learn from some of my own shortcomings. But as far as like from the standpoint of the patient, do I feel like I should be encouraging them to? I mean, it's interesting because I think we talked about this before, like because we get. I mean, I will get emails from people sometimes or letters, asking about specific, like what should I do in a specific situation, what should I do with my family member in a specific situation. Yeah, I'm curious to know. Yeah, I'd love to hear how you guys handle those. I don't know if there's a right way. I think I do it handle it differently at different times. I don't know if there's a right way to do it. Um, but yeah, I think maybe I haven't given that enough thought. I think I've been thinking about more of like what do the specifically yes about what I want young doctors, because I give a lot of talks, and so I'm very really clear about what I want doctors and other medical people to take from what I'm writing. But I think maybe I'm less clear about what I would want non-medical readers to take from it. Maybe I need to be more clear. So I'd love to hear what you guys think about that. I think I've been
Well,
less clear about
well,
that.
Sarah, I'm wondering, like you've had experience on sort of both sides of the, of the divide. Are there things you feel like you want to tell your readers or tell those doctors who are treating those readers or the people in your book?
So, I mean, like Susanna, I think it was my focus in the book was more telling the truth about what happened to sort of me as an individual. More in sort of events like this one, other Q&As that I've done, I will tell people, NAMI is a really great resource. And I think everybody who has experienced mental illness or is caring for a loved one with mental illness, the National Alliance for Mental Illness, I think really saved my family. That there are classes that you can take, free classes on how to care for a loved one with mental illness. So that was a big one. For me, as somebody who was really dealing with major depression, ketamine therapy was something that has helped me a lot, and that I try not to proselytize too much in the book, but I will talk to anyone about ketamine therapy for days on end. That was really helpful for me. And I had like pretty bad experiences with talk therapy, and that could just be my own personality, my resistance to maybe some of the elements that make that work. So, but I don't want to give recommendations because I know that my experience is just my experience. I can't tell other people, professionals or patients, how to do their jobs.
Yeah. I mean, I draw a clear line. When people write to me, I say, please make an appointment with your doctor. It's really, it's not.
I have been burned by that in the past. I used to, because I was a proselytizer in a way, and I would give my number and out to everyone, and then I've said things that I'm not a physician. Listen, I know a lot about this one specific area of medicine, but I still don't know as much as the doctors who treated me, and I shouldn't be giving any medical advice. And I said some very dumb things, like I was like, "Oh, now that you have a diagnosis, you're going to be fine. It's going to be great." And then it wasn't,
Yeah.
and there was a lot of anger, understandably. So I got burned a lot and had to kind of be very careful and do that kind of like talk to your doctor thing that doesn't feel like natural
Right.
to me because I'm not a, I'm not used to having that kind of exchange, but I had to learn to have that kind of boundary because it was inaccurate for me to say otherwise, and it was inappropriate for me to dispense any kind of real advice, even though, I do have, I helped start a nonprofit that would help connect people to doctors. So that felt like there were things that other people did around me that I could kind of push people towards that would make me feel good about that, because I could imagine being in the space of trying to find someone who had gone through what they did. And I understand why they're attracted to wanting to talk to me about it, but it became something that was ultimately not a positive thing, I think, down the
Yeah.
line.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's something I do too. I also will often push people towards like different different groups or foundation things that I think that could be helpful to them. That's something I do sometimes as well.
Yeah, and I think about the medical legal issue. I mean,
Yes.
we don't treat if you're not
Yes.
your patient, and if you're not a
Exactly.
doctor, don't give
Exactly.
medical advice.
Exactly.
There was a great question that someone submitted, Elizabeth, and she said, it takes courage to lay bare truth of what happens to us. What shift occurred to sort of get you to the point that you were strong enough to expose a personal truth? Like, Sarah, I'm wondering for you, like, what did it take to get to the point that you could write about all of this?
I know it sounds dramatic, but it was the thing I had to do to survive. I had hit such a wall with the book, with my career, with my friendships, with my life. I didn't know if I was going to become psychotic like my mom. There's so many questions, and writing the book was the thing that saved me. I had no other choice. It was either that or die. Like I didn't know, I could not see a future for myself without otherwise. So, and
So it
that
sounds like,
I'll go back to the last question and just say when people write me, they often will sort of write out their whole stories with their relationships with loved ones who had mental illness or their own experiences with mental illness, and I'll encourage them to keep writing because I do think that is the one sort of survival thing that I can tell people does work. Just write down your story.
absolutely, that's great. And Suzanne, I'm wondering for you, at what point in your recovery were you at a point where you could then even think about telling the story?
I can remember when I started being able to write again, because when I left the hospital, I could not read or write. And I started keeping a journal, and it was like it wasn't the journal that would become the basis for the book. It was like the temperature was 82 degrees, very simple kind of declaratory statements. And it was only really until I returned to work at that point, I was working at the New York Post. And I had a friend come with me to a grand rounds that was done about my case that my doctor did at NYU. And she was the one who said to me, "You should write about this." And on some level, I knew that I wanted to, but I was like, will anyone care? Is this important? But I needed to be given the permission by someone outside of myself to do it. And at that point, she actually brought it up with my editor, and I had a week to turn around an article about it. And that article contained a ton of errors, looking back, because I have a lot of false memories going on. But that kind of courage actually didn't come internally. It came from other people telling me, "Okay, you should tell this story."
It's so interesting because gives me a recollection of I had a patient with encephalitis in the ICU, and when we did a grand rounds, I invited her to come, and she commented how odd it was to hear people tell her story in the weird way that doctors speak. It was like all these different witnesses coming up on the stand. How did you find it?
Yes. Well, I mean, at one point, because they did a brain biopsy in my case and found inflammation, and there was a piece of my brain like, in a room full of, auditorium full of people, which was very strange, but also to me felt very affirming, actually, that this was important, that this as unusual as an experience as it was personally, it was also unusual for the room full of doctors. So there was something that was important about that, actually, and,
Right.
and, and very,
It's
yeah,
validating.
yeah,
Um,
validating is the word.
and I think someone asked earlier about, patients having their stories told. And I think for many patients who've been trying so hard to get their story told, when someone can write that, whether it's a journalist or their physician writer,
Mhm.
sometimes that is the first time the story truly gets told, and can be very validating, as long as obviously we treat it, with care and respect. There's another interesting question here that someone wrote about. Fiona submitted. How do you balance allowing readers into these experiences of suffering without risking traumatizing them? Because some of the things that you all have written about could be very traumatic to read. Damon, do you want to take that?
How do I risk not traumatizing the
The
reader?
reader, the reader.
Gosh, that's a great question. Because there's some difficult things that I've talked about. Um, I think you have to think. I think for me, for my way I approach it is, what is the purpose of telling the story, right? Is it just to like tell the story just as so this is horrible thing, or is there some other kind of bigger lesson or bigger goal or aim in telling the story? Like are we trying to frame like this is? And so for me, that's what kind of helps me think through how I'm because if you're just telling something terrible just for the sake of doing it, then yeah, I think that's like what's the point, right? But I do think that in order for there, I really do believe that in order for there to be progress, we have to face hard truths. I mean, I think that's just we think about even our society, our history of our country, and we think about how do things actually really improve? Things we had to really face hard truths. We had to really go through them, not around them. So I think the way that I think about these stories, the goal is to really advance medicine, advance how we practice medicine, improve the care. But and in order to do so, sometimes we have to face the downsides, the limitations, the harms that we may have done in order to come out on the other side. So that's what sort of drives me when I think about telling those stories.
Thank you. Sarah. I'm wondering if you've thought about that when you're writing about particularly traumatic experiences. Do you ever think about, ooh, are the readers going to get traumatized by this?
Well, I think good, relatable writing comes out of strong emotion, right? So it's good to feel discomfort or pain sometimes. I don't think, I mean, you'll come back from it. And maybe I think in my own experience, sometimes the worst pain I felt has revealed the most important truths. And I think that's why we read, right? That's why we engage with difficult art. Maybe it moves things around. And maybe that's what being emotionally moved is, right? I mean, in some ways it can feel, I think traumatizing is a word that has sort of had a lot of definition creep. I
I
don't
agree.
I don't know that reading my memoir could necessarily traumatize somebody who didn't experience the things in it. But if they make you sad, maybe that's a good thing.
Yeah. Susanna, wondering how you feel about that.
Uh, Beautifully put. I think like I love Kafka's line that writing is supposed to break the frozen sea within, and I believe that truly. I mean, great writing moves you, as you said, and that movement isn't just about bliss and joy and happiness. That there's trauma there too, and so that was not something I was thinking about while I was writing the book at all.
And
And so,
sometimes it's facing that is what also makes people makes push people for change. I mean, sometimes you have to face
Yes.
those things in order to really make things better. You have to face the real harshness of life in all sorts of ways to really move forward in a constructive way as individuals, but also as a society.
right. And I imagine you've all gotten all kinds of responses from your readers. Any responses that were surprising or unexpected that you got? Susanna, did you get anything that you didn't expect?
Yeah. I mean, the whole thing was unexpected. Like when I was going out on proposal for Brain on Fire, I was rejected by every publisher but one. The publisher who published me, they were like, maybe see what happens. There was no like real expectation, and for some reason, I'll never really know. It had a life beyond what I could have ever expected. So the whole thing was unexpected. But what's been great is that it's had this like kind of like secondary life where people have been inspired by the book and created things like a clothing line and a ballet, and I got to go to one of the kind of dances. There were actually two dances based on Brain on Fire, and it has been and a very bad movie, but that it's okay. but but I that was amazing, like seeing this people take that and like to your question before, like take a traumatic experience. A lot of people who are creating work out, inspired by Brain on Fire had either their own experience with a brain disorder, or I mean, in some cases it was like really a profound heartbreak, and they alchemized it into something new and exciting and different, and that to me was like just the coolest thing.
Wow. Wow. Damon, any unusual responses that you weren't expecting from readers?
Well, Susanna, so someone says they became a neuropsychologist because of your book. So I've had those kind of reactions now. My first book has been out, for over 10 years, and people have said they've gone to medical school and because of my first book, and now they're on the other side, and they graduated. So those are always tremendously, hard. And you get, and they just pop up the most random time. You get an email in your inbox, and the most random time, and you're like, oh wow. And so those are great. As far as surprising stories, some of the ones that are like when you write about things like race and mental illness, they can be potentially volatile. People can project all sorts of things onto them. So some of the more interesting responses were people who've told me that one person told me that for the first book they hated the idea of a person writing about race, and then against their better judgment they opened the book, and once they opened it, they learned so much about everything, including themselves. And I had a similar response with my second book, where someone said they hated psychiatrists, and they didn't want it, and they never wanted to read the book, but then somehow, against their better judgment, they opened the book and they learned something, totally new about the field and about themselves. So those are always like when you have someone who's totally on the opposite end, he's like an antagonist who then can become someone that really sort of begins to appreciate what you're trying to do. Those are always super gratifying and unexpected.
Well, I think that really personifies the Kafka quote, Susanna, that you mentioned about unlocking the frozen sea for someone who reads your book. And I mean, what more could you ask for?
Yeah, exactly.
Uh, Sarah, any unusual responses to your book, things you didn't expect?
Well, I think just sort of similar to Susanna, where I didn't write this manuscript thinking anything was going to happen with it. I think also, as somebody who had been raised by a mother who I believe had borderline personality disorder when I was young and then had schizophrenia, there was a lot of sort of very off kilter and weird things that happened to me as a child. And I hadn't really spoken about them because I didn't expect anyone to believe me. And then the fact that people do believe me and will say my mom was exactly the same, it's like I'm reading my own story, has been really validating and really surprising, because you think you're the only person this is happening to when you're a child. Your mom's your whole world. My mom raised me alone. As a single mom, I didn't, I, and it's just such a weird experience. And to have other people say, wow, same thing happened to me, has been surprising. For
Well,
sure.
that's so gratifying to hear. I know we're getting close to the end. Just as sort of a last question to ask each of you, for someone trying to write about their own inner life, whether it be just their own inner history, their mental illness, their trauma, where should they begin? Suzanne, I'm going to start with you. Where should they begin?
I'm probably gonna like speak for everyone because it's this. I mean, I think all of us have the same, typically have the same responses. It's to start. Am I right? I mean, like really, it's just to get, like to carve out. And life is very complicated. There are so much kind of drawing at our time. But if you can take 30 minutes a day, longer if you can do it, work up to longer, just writing. I like to write sometimes when I'm just in the beginning or I feel stuck or I don't know where to go, just pen and paper again, go back and start there. That tactile sensation. I think just finding that time and just doing it really is my offer there. Yeah.
Damon, and any writing tips?
Yeah, people always, people come to ask me all the time, how did you write a book? How can I write a book? I always tell, like, yeah, I always tell them sort of my own story. I always say, just start small. We're trying to write a book just seems so overwhelming to start with, and just start with something really small, and pick a specific story, specific point in your time, a topic or area in your life, whatever you want to write about, and just focus on that, and just sort of see where that goes. Share that with people, and then you can sort of build on, expand upon it. Because that's certainly how I did it. It was very much. I never started the idea I was going to write a book. It was very much. I had these experiences that were happening in medical school, and how do I make sense of them? And it all just kind of almost like the pen and paper. You started really small, a couple stories, here and there. But then once you get further along, and you think you actually are going to get to write a book, it's all about then just about the muscle memory. Like, I'm going to just do 300 words every day, and I'm going to just, whether it's terrible or not terrible, I'm just going to put it out there, and then I can kind of go back and work on it. But I would say for someone who's just starting out, it's really the idea of just starting small. Thinking about smaller publications, smaller things. Don't think about like the book, much smaller, and then work your way out.
Yes, think literary journals, folks. Literary
Yes,
journals. How about you,
absolutely.
Sarah? What's your writing advice, either technically or about writing about the inner life?
So I would add to that, start small, but also imitate people that you like. So when I was in grad
Yes, yes, yes,
school,
yes.
I interned at the New Yorker, And one of the best things about it, because I wasn't getting paid, was there were like a million literary journals that you could just take home. And so I would read them and then I would fall in love with these essays or short stories. And then I would find these like smaller writers who weren't famous and I would fall in love with their work and then I would try to write like them. And I think that's kind of how everyone, whether they'll admit it or not, like gets their start, right? They find a writer, an artist they love, and they try to imitate whatever it is that's inspiring them and give that to a reader. So read a lot and imitate writers you like.
Well, thank you for that.
100%.
Edward Hirsch, the president of the Guggenheim Foundation, once said that literary journals, they tell us the news, right? They bring to you new writers. So what a great way to segue. That if you haven't gotten your copy of Bellevue Literary Review, head over to blreview.org. You can rectify that situation immediately. And at a time when the world around us feels kind of crazy itself, BLR is the perfect prescription for thoughtful, probing, and I would say sane writing. My deepest thanks to Susanna Callahan, Damon Tweedy, and Sarah Labrie for such a thoughtful and generous conversation, for helping us to think not just about the mind, but the language that we use to hold it and to get it, damn it, onto the page. Thank you for the audience who joined, who submitted questions, who asked questions. We didn't get to them all, but we really appreciate that. And if you check out BLR's website, we have BLR's book club, we have writing workshops, submission opportunities. It's really wonderful to share our 25th anniversary with all of you. And thanks for joining us. And we'll see you all at the next event. Have a good night.
I love BLR. I love BLR.
Thank you. I do too.
Thank you.
See you guys.